So I'm just going to start by saying a quick welcome. We've still got people coming in, so we'll give it a moment or two for everyone to get here. But can I start by asking those of you who are in the room, just to make sure for the first little bit your microphones are off and you're on mute. Later on, we're absolutely going to turn this into an interactive session and have a Q&A, but it just really helps at the beginning so we don't get feedback to have people on mute. And while you're on mute, I'm going to ask you to use your reactions button. So at the bottom of your screen, you probably see reactions. There might be an option to raise your hand, or if not, there's other kinds of symbols you can use: thumbs up, clapping, hearts, things like that. Just going to start by asking all of you who've read the book just to put your hand up or put some other kinds of reaction on screen so we can get a sense of whether or not we're pitching this to an audience who know or don't the text. Okay, it's a mixture. There's lots of people who've read it, but also several who haven't. Okay, that's really good to know. And that means I think we'll try and keep away from spoilers, but we will definitely ask those of you who have read it to engage. We've got lots of people here now, so I think I'm going to start off by introducing our guest for today, Esther Freud, who we're really delighted to have joining us. This is the first in a series of events we have celebrating the Lucian Freud centenary. And one of those events coming later on, and I'll talk about these at the end, is going to be a visit to Freud Museum, where you can see Lucian in context of his family. And another is with Dr. Helen Fry, who's the author of Freud's War, who's going to have a look at members of the Freud family who participated in World War II and that history of leaving Nazi-occupied Europe. And that's what we're looking at today too. We're looking at the European background and the émigré background, but we're looking at it through literary fiction. Esther is a very well-known novelist, although when I was researching her, I was really interested to see that your first proper job wasn't writing at all, but playing an alien in Doctor Who. Is that right?
That is true. It was a very brief moment in time, but I did want to be an actress originally, and I went to drama school, and when I left, I got that job. It wasn't my very first job, but it was probably the most high-profile job I'd had in that first year of acting. And yeah, it was something that has really hovered in my life ever since. It's very funny.
I thought it was so interesting. I mean, it's a lovely kind of anecdote to tell, but also I thought it was so interesting you were playing an alien, because a lot of your novels, and particularly this one, are about people who are somehow other or feeling other or in strange lands. And we might talk later on about whether that sense of alienation pervades your work deliberately and how much it's rooted maybe in that family history. But other than being an alien on Doctor Who, you're much, much more well known as a novelist whose work includes your very first book, Hideous Kinky, which was shortlisted for the John Llewellyn Prize, and many further novels and also plays. Stitches had a sellout run at London's Jermyn Street Theatre. Mr. Mac and Me, which is also set in Suffolk, and of course this novel, The Sea House, which I'm hoping many of you will have read and will enjoy engaging with us about tonight. So Esther, will you start us off? Will you read us maybe a little extract from The Sea House and talk to us about how you came to write it?
Absolutely. I'll just talk a little bit first before I read about how I came to write it, because I always have, not always, but often books breed other books. So I need to really go back a little bit and talk about a novel I wrote called Gaglow, which is sort of, its name has slowly been changed over the years to Summer at Gaglow. which was its American name. That was a book that I wrote that really was quite life-changing for me in terms of my own sort of personal development and my development as a writer. So I'd written these two fairly semi-autobiographical novels, Hideous, Kinky and Peerless Flats, set it within my life, drawing on my own childhood experience. And I had started something else that was a little bit similar. I was finding myself, assuaged with the normal doubts, but maybe slightly more loudly than usual. And I had been sitting for my father a lot. And my father lived very much in the present. I mean, it's very interesting to me, that whole idea of different ways of being as a sort of descendant of emigres or refugees. And my father was a child when he came to England. And I know that some people become very closely bonded with their families and cling together, and others, like my father and his younger brother anyway, I didn't know his older one so much, but they were very rebellious in terms of being their own people and not wanting to feel as if they were defined by their families. And so my father didn't talk about his family very much. And I like to think that each generation has to rebel in their own way. I became totally fascinated and was always asking him questions, but I had to do it very subtly because he didn't really like a question that was unsubtly direct. So I would sort of catch him when he was off guard and just want to know. And I really focused on, I was very interested in his mother, who I looked very alike, and I'd seen photographs when she was young. And because my father led quite a rackety and anarchic life, he didn't introduce many of his children to his parents. Whether his parents even knew of our existence, I'm not certain. So I was very intrigued by her. And so I was always trying to find out. And so I took some of the questions, some of the little bits of information that I discovered about his mother's very liberal, bourgeois, Jewish family, wealthy family in Berlin. They had a house somewhere outside Berlin called Gaglow, and he talked about visiting his grandmother, who apparently his mother and her two sisters disapproved of. She sounded rather wonderful. I can't even remember now why they disapproved of her, but she sort of played cards and drank and was a rather rackety character herself. And I sort of collected up little bits of information that he told me. And one day I suddenly woke and thought, no, I'm not going to write this novel that I'm writing. I'm going to write something about this family in Germany during the First World War, when the brother of these three sisters went off into the army as a patriotic German, with everything that sort of stood for. And I wanted to sort of look at that moment in time that seemed so recent to the moment in time only 20 years later, when, he would not have been welcomed into the army. Obviously, he would have been fleeing for his life, and how that could change so quickly. So I did lots of research. I realized I really did have a tiny handful of stories that could take maybe a page or two, and I was done. So I started going, this is pre-internet. I started going to libraries and finding memoirs in German and having them translated and interviewing all sorts of people. And it was pretty backbreaking work. But in the process of it, I really started to feel as if I was connected to a generation or two before me. And that was very, as it turned out, important for me. And when this book, Gaglow, was published, it's a very long-winded answer to your story. Ultimately, it gave birth to the Sea House because so many people came forward and said, oh, I've got a photograph of the house Gaglow, or, relatives I'd never met said, would you like to have lunch? Or people were so surprised that I had created this story based, very minutely on a real story, but I had sort of embedded everyone's imagination back into the past that wasn't that distant. And so my father surprised me more than anyone by saying, I have something for you. And I went over to where he lived, always in his studio, and he had a huge, rather ancient carrier bag stuffed with letters. And he said, these are the letters of my parents, the correspondence throughout their whole marriage. He said, maybe you'd like to use them. And I knew what he meant, yes, I will try and use them. So I took these letters home, and I was in the middle of another novel by then, and I spread them over my study floor, and I arranged them into the order of the addresses. So there was my grandmother when she was Fräulein Brasch, and she lived in Charlottenburg with her family. And then there was when she was Frau Freud, and she had married my grandfather, and they lived in Regentenstrasse in Berlin. On it went, and then there were the letters in London, and then letters to this little village in Suffolk that I'd already started going to and was absolutely passionate about. And I had been thinking for a while that I'd like to write a novel set in this village. And so I took these letters and I read them in different sort of batches. And I started to understand so much about the family, about my grandparents who I didn't know, about the way my father had been raised and what they'd gone through in order to come to England, the decisions that they'd made. And then their move to Suffolk and the sort of jokes that they made about how it was like their holiday house in Hiddensee, when there was a wonderful letter from him saying, I found the place for us. The sea is even colder and there are even more mosquitoes. I think you'll be happy. And I, as part of my research for the Sea House, I went to Hiddensee, and it was remarkably similar. And so I knew where I was going to set this book, and I knew I was going to use the letters. They were very, very romantic letters, continued to be so through many decades. He was obviously very sort of jealously passionate about his wife. And I started to kind of claw together bits of information that made me really feel as if I was at the heart of my family. And I've sort of joked since that my father really did everything he could to escape from his family. And I've done everything I can to put myself at the center of my family. And this book really was the result. So on that note, I will read. There was something else that I needed to put into the book, which I had always had a recurring dream about a house, different houses. I had a very peripatetic childhood, and I was quite obsessed with a home. And one of the things that really surprised me about this village in Suffolk was that someone I think it was in the 30s, I've changed all the dates around for the sake of this book, but someone in the 30s, an artist called John Donan Turner, had painted every house in the village on a long scroll. And one day it was on show in the village hall, and it was wrapped around a table, a sort of old, like an old table, football table. And he was turned a handle, this man, who was an artist himself, actually. And slowly all the houses revolved, and you could see every house in the village. And I thought, if I could paint, I would draw a painting of every house in this village. I love these houses so much, and I've always been curious about each and every house. So I decided to make this man, who was actually a clerk from somewhere in Croydon, and came to this little village in Suffolk regularly, and did these paintings. I decided to make him into a refugee, a Kindertransport child who missed his home terribly, and he inherited my recurring dreams about belonging and homes, and he could never decide which of these houses to paint, so he decides to paint them all. His name is Max. The one thing I took from John Donan Turner, who was deaf, was that Max is deaf. And I used a memoir as well that someone had sent me, someone that I had found a memoir and used it in Gaglow, and it turned out to be the father of this man. So he sent me his own memoir, and it was all about homesickness and maps that he'd done of his home, his childhood home, that he'd also been a Kindertransport child. So as you can see, I've woven many things into my stories. And I start the book with Max arriving in a little village, which I call Steerborough, and going to stay with a woman called Gertrude Jilks, who was a child psychoanalyst. I'm sure it's very interesting to any analyst, but I can never say the word psychoanalyst ever. I don't know what it means. But she, I kind of based her very slightly on Anna Freud, who also lived in this village. And I heard that she paid for the son of her cleaner to have piano lessons. So I've used that too. So here we go. Gertrude's house was pink, that stone ground Suffolk pink that managed to be manly, and from the front it looked closed in and dark. Max waited for a moment before knocking on the door, wondering who had built on the ugly, flat-roofed porch, and then a shadow appeared behind the mottled glass. "Come in, come in!" Gertrude spoke too loudly, unable to accept Max couldn't hear, and he stood quite still in the open doorway and watched the exaggerated movements of her mouth. Max Meyer was in Steerborough to see if he might do a painting of Marsh End. It was a mercy invitation, a probable last wish from his sister Kata, but all the same, he was grateful to have been asked, grateful to Gertrude for remembering him and asking him to come. "Dear Max," she'd written, "I know how much you must be suffering your loss, how much we, all of us, miss Kata, but would you consider coming up to do a picture of my house? I shall be here all summer. If you feel you can, please let me know, and I'll explain about the trains." The letter was dated May the 29th, and to his surprise, within a week, he had packed up his paints and brushes, a roll of canvas and some cloths, and set out for Liverpool Street Station to catch the first of 3 connecting trains. Gertrude Jilks was a child psychoanalyst, a woman with no children of her own, but standing beside her on the doorstep was a small boy with white blonde hair. Gertrude didn't introduce him, and he stood there looking at his feet, shuffling them back and forth inside his shoes. "Come in," Gertrude said again, and Max remembering with a pang that she disliked him. "Yes, thank you, of course." He lowered his head, and together they stepped through into the main part of the house, a drawing room with French windows open to the lawn, dark furniture falling into shadow after the shock of so much sun. Max walked across the wooden floor and out into the garden. The lawn was rich and wide, spreading out in lanes to one tall tree, a spruce pine with sand around its roots, and as Max walked out to it, his bag still in his hand, he imagined that behind the raised ridge of garden hedge, the ground was shingled to the sea. "Yes," he said, "I will paint the house, the back of the house, certainly." There was a bench cradled up against one wall, and the windows on the upper floor were open to the sky. "That is the house." Gertrude had followed him. "Alf," she said, turning, "you may go." Alf was 7. He was the only child of her cleaning lady, and Gertrude was paying for him to learn the piano. Didn't want piano lessons, but it didn't seem right just to give him money. So each Saturday at 2:30, he went to Miss Cheese for his lesson, and then came back to give her his report. No, he wasn't making any progress, she explained to Max, but there was nothing else to do but carry on. "I see," Max nodded, although he wasn't at all sure that he did, and Gertrude picked up his bag and showed him to his room. "Thank you." I can't hear you now.
You would think by now I'd remember when to take my mute off. But thank you very much. That was such a fascinating introduction, and lovely to hear the first chapter. So I know the town in Suffolk that this is based on quite well. I had friends who lived there, and after my mother died, actually, they invited me there. So I connect it to a place of walking and thinking about loss and healing, and under that very, very specific Suffolk sky as well, which is something you capture beautifully in the novel. And you started off by introducing us to Max's perspective in, I believe it's 1953.
Yes.
But actually the chapters alternate with another voice, Lily, who is kind of a young woman, I think who I felt very connected to actually, who is coming here to study the architect Klaus, who is based on your grandfather, who has a house in the village, which is a house that Max, well, might or might not paint when he goes around painting his scroll. There's quite an interesting decision, isn't there, that he makes that will be explored. But Lily, as a young woman who is studying Klaus, plays out a parallel modern day story to Max's. Is she based on you? I was wondering also about the name Lily, because with the kind of symbolism of the sea, and I was thinking a lot about Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse and Lily, and wondering if that had anything to do with your naming of her.
That's so interesting. I actually have never read To the Lighthouse. I don't know why, and I always mean to, but I did have a review that mentioned that. And I remember thinking, well, they didn't ask the question. They just said it was obviously in some ways a homage, or, in some ways a retelling of and I thought, well, obviously not, since I haven't read it, but maybe these things are in the ether in some way. No, it's always very hard to find exactly the right name, and that seemed like the right name for her. I also wanted her to have an L name, because something very lovely in my grandparents' letters is they called each other the same name. I didn't know why. I have since found out it was a very strange and abstract reason, but all letters were addressed Lieber Lim and From Lim. So there were two Lim and From Lim, even though they were called Lucy and Ernst. So I like the idea of playing with that. And so I give them Lehman and Elsa, so they can still call each other L, and then Lily is L. So I was looking for L's. That was why Lily came there. What's so strange and interesting, when I was reading it for the sake of this book club, and I honestly have not looked at this book it's about 20 years since I wrote it, I was just amazed how complicated it was. I just remembered that I'd written these two storylines, but no, not at all. I actually do not know why it's so complicated. I'm sure it can't have been necessary. I think it was because I had so many stories to tell, and I was trying to work out a way to tell them. But I did really enjoy, I had a really clear idea when I was sort of looking at all the letters and thinking, how am I going to tell this story? It came to me very clearly what I wanted to do. And that's so not usually the case. Usually years go by and you just think, I have a story, but please, someone help me tell the story. I don't know how to tell it. This one, I really knew what to do. And I wrote it with probably more ease and pleasure than almost any of my 9 novels. I have a real fondness for it for that reason. So Lily, in a way, Lily's story in the novel is more straightforward. She is an architecture student in her final year, and she is involved in a relationship of some years with an architect, very hardworking and ambitious and taken up with work. And as she starts to study Lehman and look at all his buildings, and then she goes and rents a cottage in Steerborough in order to sort of finish her dissertation, or whatever it is that you do at the end of architecture. I can't remember now. She starts to be more and more embroiled with reading the letters that she has managed to get from a relative of Lehman. I can't actually now remember how she gets hold of these letters. Seems highly unlikely, but I believed in it at the time. And she finds herself less interested in his references to architecture than in the really intimate and passionate relationship he has with his wife. And she starts to really think about love. And I suppose that was the driving force. So she goes on a journey from being someone very focused on her career to really reassessing the choices she's making in life, and whether or not she wants to have this rather brusque and focused on work relationship she has with Nick. And she starts to really reassess everything. And I enjoyed writing that a lot. I'd been saving up visual images of the Suffolk village and the sea, the marshes, the little lanes, all the words. I'd been storing them up for years, years and years. And the joy of having a sort of vessel to put them into and being able to sort of pour them out, particularly in the Lily scenes, because she's so enamored of the place. I think Max too, but he's got a lot else going on. I feel that Lily is the one who really goes into some purple prose about it, which made me slightly blush as I was reading through. But that is so how I felt about it, and still do really. But I'm probably a little bit more restrained now.
It's amazing, isn't it, looking back at our young selves. And I mean, one of the things that I did catch when I reread the novel to do the session today was Lily was the contemporary voice having to go to a phone box to ring her boyfriend Nick. And I was thinking, gosh, I mean, red phone boxes now, we all have mobiles.
I know.
Just amazing how much the world changes even in 20 years.
I mean, even then, when it's set in sort of 2000, I think, because it's the centenary, someone's taking pictures of all the village to make a kind of photographic record of the centenary. And obviously most people, it was still unusual that she would have to go to the phone box. Most people would obviously have a telephone. But actually, when I did first rent a cottage in this village, there was no phone. And I really loved that. And I loved that phone box. And most phone boxes now, little libraries and things. I think that phone box still is there. I haven't been. I used to have the number on my phone, so that on my mobile, so that when my youngest son passed it, I used to press it and say, oh, the phone's ringing. And then he'd pick it up and I would play a game. So for a long time, I still used that phone box for entertainment.
Well, I mean, not having a phone certainly helps with creativity and the creative life, without all the distractions. And this is actually, I mean, this is a novel, and I think this will be my last question before we open it up to the audience. But for me, this felt like, yes, a novel about history and a novel about place. But more than that, it felt about the act of creation, whether that was about painting or architecture and house building, or in fact writing itself. And all these letters going back and forth, there's the correspondence between Klaus and Elsa, or Lehman and Elsa, but there's also these letters that come to Max from his mentor, Henry, which are teaching him about what it means to make art. And to create, and I think that's what made me think of To the Lighthouse, actually, because that's based on the idea of painting. So but there's this notion underneath it all that on the one hand there is history and there is love and there is escape and alienation and moving between places, but on the other it felt like a love letter to the creative act. Was that how you imagined it?
I didn't ever think of it like that, but when I just started to do some research on John Doman Turner, I discovered that he had entered into a correspondence course with an artist called Spencer Gore. And I was determined to get hold of these letters because a few of them had been reproduced in a catalogue of an exhibition of some of John Doman Turner's work, but also some of Spencer Gore's work that had been in a little gallery, sadly, before I'd become interested. So all I had was this catalogue with just a few little snippets of, what does art mean, and sort of very cryptic and witty correspondence from Spencer Gore's side. And so through my father, he said, well, I know Spencer Gore's son, and I'll help you get in touch with him. So Freddie Gore, the son of Spencer Gore, was quite elderly, and he didn't want me to take the letters, which he had and had had. And it was actually a very moving story. The thing about writing a novel is there's so many other stories you discover as you're writing that you almost go sideways. So Spencer Gore had actually died before Freddie was born. And Freddie had spent his life doing everything he could to uphold the reputation of his father, who was an artist of great talent. But, it's all about legacy, in danger of being forgotten. So he'd mounted exhibitions and he was in the world of art himself. And his great desire was that these letters should be published. And I said, well, look, I can't publish them, but I will use some of them and I will credit them in the book. And he said, well, you can come and read them in my house. And so I spent hours, days sitting there reading them and taking notes. And obviously I didn't have my mobile to take photos of them. Would have been so useful. So I wrote down and sometimes even recorded the bits I thought were useful. And they were absolutely marvelous. But so I created a fictional figure that the German-born Max in some ways gets involved with as a budding artist himself. And he enters into a very similar relationship. There was something so moving and interesting for me about creativity, but also about ambition. And I hope that this came across in the book, because it's quite a small moment. But something I discovered in the letters between John Doman Turner and Spencer Gore was first of all, Spencer Gore's in it. He's totally uninterested in this artist. He's not very talented. He accepts a little bit of money and he thinks, well, a bit of extra money, I'll look at his work. So he sends him his work. He writes back saying, yes, no, ditch that one, work on that one. And then slowly they begin a really beautiful relationship and he starts to really love his work. And then one day he says, I've got an exhibition, 3 paintings. Yes, it's going to happen. And Don Doman Turner comes back to him and says, oh, congratulations. And he says, no, you idiot, not mine, yours. I've got you an exhibition. And Doman Turner doesn't want it. He doesn't want to be successful. He just, whatever it is that stops people from sort of taking the lid off, he wants to be an amateur artist on some level. He just is too scared, or he doesn't believe in himself enough. And then they have a very touching correspondence about this. And I tried to create this with Max is obviously very talented too, but he stays within his realm because both men are deaf. So maybe it's to do with just feeling safe. So I looked at creativity very much in that aspect of the book. The solace it brings people. When you look at the scroll, which has actually, through various recent endeavors, been mounted on boards, and it can be seen not just twice a year on the football table. It's actually been photographed and preserved, which is a marvelous thing. The village kind of put together funds for this to happen. And I think it must have given a huge amount of pleasure to the artist who did that. And as for Lily, I think she starts to see that she, as so many architects do, including my grandfather, including also Charles Rainey Mackintosh, who I wrote about in another Suffolk book, they do start off often wanting to be artists. And the parents are concerned, as Ernst's parents, Sigmund and his wife, this isn't a way to ever make any money. So you're good at art, become an architect. So when my father decided he wanted to be an artist, I think the latent frustration of, Ernst not being allowed to be an artist, he was really encouraged to be one. They thought, okay, another chance, we'll support this one. He's got talent. Let's let him see where he goes. So a long answer again, there's many stories within this.
And was that the same with your father to you? I mean, as the novelist, to encourage you to go with the creative act?
He was really encouraging. When I told him I wanted to be an actress, just like my father, though, my father hated the fact that his parents were slightly too encouraging. Apparently his mother went to one of his first shows and bought everything. And he literally never went to an opening of an exhibition ever again in case it happened. My father then deeply embarrassed me by seeing if he could be helpful. And he invited the most famous actor at the time was John Hurt, who was doing The Elephant Man, to meet me at dinner at midnight somewhere to give me some advice. I was like, I just want to be in a play somewhere on the fringe or something. Anyway, it's a typical thing that happens between parents and children, and it's a high-class problem, but he was very, very encouraging always, yes.
Fantastic. Well, we have some of our audience who'd like to talk to you. So shall we start by bringing up Joe Fisher, Emma, who has a question for you. And Joe, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Oh, hello. I've really enjoyed the book. And my question was, I felt I knew the place. I felt it was Warbleswick in Southwold. I have a wonderful sketch made at the beginning of the 20th century of the wonderful dark buildings there that are by the water. And I always felt it was like a Turner, and I bought it because of that. And so I just wondered if you could confirm it, because I just felt the whole time I was reading the book, I was in Warbleswick, where I went for a few days. And I just wondered if you could confirm that, or you're keeping it a secret.
No, I don't need to keep it a secret. It is. I sometimes say openly it's Warbleswick, and sometimes I think, oh, it has so many visitors, I should keep it quiet. But it's such a special place. And if you recognize it, then that adds, I think, to the pleasure of imagining yourself there.
Yeah,
and one of the reasons I set it in 1953 and not earlier was because in 1953, there was a huge flood along that whole eastern coast. And a lot of those buildings, which the Sea House in my imagination was one of, were washed away. And I wanted that to be part of my story. That the sort of transience of, because so much of it is about houses and solidity and architecture. So, yeah. And I also managed then, of course, because it's 53, to get the Queen's coronation in. So it's just irrelevant to this particular week.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to read. And I think the imagination of Suffolk, because Suffolk is a lovely county, but just that area is so beautiful. And you just kept bringing it back, and I'm going, I know this place, I know where I am, but I'm sure I don't, but it was lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, talking about landscapes, we've talked about the Suffolk a lot, Walberswick, because we know it is now, but you build the relationships the whole time between Suffolk and Hiddensee, even to Max putting the little symbols from the houses across. And I just wondered if you'd like to talk a little bit about Hiddensee and that landscape, which was so important to your family.
I was so intrigued by the idea of Hiddensee, and my grandparents, when they moved to Walberswick, they bought an old house and they called it Hidden House. It was very hidden. And until I started researching this book, I assumed it was for that reason, but it turned out they'd named it after Hiddensee. And I actually wanted to call the book Hidden Sea, but it was too mysterious. I realized I'd used too mysterious a title for various other books, and it doesn't help really. But I decided to visit, and I actually wrote a piece about my trip to visit it for a travel magazine. I don't remember, but as a result of that, I got sort of taken by someone from the German Tourist Board. And so I think I flew to Hamburg, I got a train to Rügen, and then there was a ferry, because it is an island, across to Hiddensee, which is an island that has no cars. And everyone is very quiet. Everyone sort of sails around on bicycles, apart from me, because I was there as a visitor of the tourist board. They had a car and they zoomed me across the island, and I was so embarrassed. The last thing I wanted. But it was so familiar. I felt so at home. In Walberswick, there were a lot of thatched houses with little sort of peephole windows in the thatch, which maybe my grandfather, who did a lot of refurbishment to houses in the village, maybe he put those in, or maybe that's just a coincidence. But there's a very similar feeling. It's very flat, apart from it has one hill at the end of the island, but mostly it's completely flat and has a beautiful sandy beach, and is full of lots of artistic people. And sort of a famous poet lived there. And my father was so amazed that I was going back. I mean, he had spent every summer of his life until he was 10, and he remembered that there were 2 ferries that travelled back and forth from the mainland. And he said, oh, Shanti and Retruvi, something like that. And I saw one of them. It had been made into a cafe, and it was sort of beached up on the shore with a little kind of, kuchen and cafe. And he also said that the place that they had lived, he said, he described it exactly. He said, see if you can find it. Had a big pear tree in the garden, and it was attached, on one side lived a fishing family called Colvitts. And he described the children who were a little bit younger than him, and maybe they were still there. So when I arrived, I asked around, and they said, "Oh yes, yes, Karl Kollwitz, he's just fishing down on the port. I'll tell him." So he came, and he was just amazed, and he they had been in East Germany all those many decades, and never seen any of those people that they spent time with before the war ever again. And tears came into his eyes, and he said Gabby, Lux and Clay. So that was my father and his two brothers, and how they were named when they were little children in Germany. So he invited me to supper that night. And when I arrived, he said that he had caught an eel, especially, and he'd cooked it up. It was honestly one of the most disgusting things I've ever eaten. And I politely, and then he went through old photos and found some photographs of all 5 of the children, my father and his brothers, and he and his sister standing outside the house with a pear tree. He just moved, honestly, about 3 minutes walk from that house, and he'd lived there his whole life. And his sister, he said, had just gone to town and was staying the night, and would have been so sad that to have missed me.
Wow. And actually both the eel and the pear tree do appear in the book.
Yes, I tried to use everything I could.
So I think that's a really interesting thing, actually, how much you are picking from history. And also with Hidden I did notice Annie Freud had a poetry collection out last year with Hidden as the title. So she didn't have the same caveat you did about the naming. But there is something obviously about talking about this kind of family history through fiction, through literary fiction and creative arts, as opposed to the straightforward memoir biographical approach. What do you think that fiction gives us about these experiences that maybe you don't get through that straightforward historical retelling?
Well, I never feel I know enough to tell it straightforwardly historically, but then choosing to do it through fiction, you add in all sorts of other things. So you make it less and more complicated along the way. I've always had ideas come to me in forms, and the forms have always been fiction. And sometimes I'm asked to write an article, and then I'm thrown into a completely different world where I'm checking facts and trying to sort of weave a story, but obviously one that can be checked. Whereas the glory of fiction is you can kind of, if you can't find something out completely, you can just find another way of saying it. You don't get so bogged down with that.
And you're still telling the truth, it's just a different kind of truth, right?
Yes, exactly. Yes, I mean, it's one of the reasons why with this book I changed the name from Walberswick to Steerborough and to Southwold to Easternall, because I wanted to have the railway, and the railway had actually used to come to Walberswick but stopped sometime before 1953. But I really wanted to use scenes of the railway, and I knew that if I included that, I'd get lots of letters saying, "Did you know the railway stopped?" I really don't want to read those letters, so I just changed the names. But with Mr. Mac and Me, I started off changing the names, and then I realized there was nothing I needed to change. So I actually used the real names of all the surrounding villages, and the railway did exist because the railway comes into it. If you're going to have a railway, it's just irresistible. So I didn't want to get rid of that. Yeah, so I do use, that was a book that I, in a way, I did have to work much harder to make sure every single thing was accurate. I felt I had a responsibility to it because it was a real person, whereas the Sea House, everyone is a mixture.
Okay, well, I'm going to come back to that in a second, but I just wanted to say to our audience, if there is anyone else who does have a question and want to ask anything, please do either put a note in the chat or just put your virtual hand up, or even your real hand, and wave at us, because we'd love to bring other people in as well. But meanwhile, since there haven't been that many questions.
I can see one real hand waving.
Is that a hand? Is that Ed Allen waving a hand? Emma, would you bring Ed up? Ed, would you unmute yourself? Is that?
Yes, hello. Emma, thank you. I enjoyed the book, Esther. Thank you. I enjoyed it. I also recognise the locations. The one thing that I couldn't put together and was the other relationship that Lily has with the neighbour, with Gray and his children. So how does that fit the shall we say the main plot? What have I missed perhaps in that section?
Do you know, I thought the same when I was reading through it today. I thought, gosh, that was a strange choice to make. But I think what I was really trying to do was to show that I think Lily's eyes are opened to the idea of other relationships. And so she sort of starts to look around, and I wanted to sort of show that you can make romantic assumptions about people very easily. So she sort of makes an assumption about Gray, and she gets it wrong. And then she realizes that actually he's a good man and that he is the one who's being victimized. But then ultimately she realizes, along with us, hopefully, or certainly me, because I actually thought at one point that maybe that was a chance for her. And then I started to realize in the process of it that that wasn't the right thing for her. So I think I was really following a sort of thread, as you do when you're pulling away from the person you're with, or if you're single, that you start to sort of look around and you put all sorts of meanings into the relationships you see around you, whether you think that people are gloriously happy, getting on incredibly badly. So, and also I was quite interested in that idea of a man. It's not really talked about so much, a man being the victim of domestic abuse. And the assumption would be that it would be the other way around. When I first rented a cottage in Walberswick, it was very, very thin walled. And so I was quite obsessed with the neighbours. So that was sort of tied in. When I first started writing this book, I just moved from that place. So I thought quite a lot about that particular little cottage that I'd rented and all the goings on next door.
I think there is something very interesting. I'm really glad that Ed's brought this up, because there's also something really interesting. Oh, thank you, Ed. Not just about Gray, but about the children, about the two little girls, and also the role of the child in the book, that childhood versus adulthood. I mean, we have Alf in the 1953 narrative versus the girls, but we also have the kind of growing up, the coming of age of Max. And coming of age is something you've written quite a lot about in other books. I mean, with girls, with Love Falls, with Two Sisters, there's Hideous Kinky. I just wondered if that, and kind of having the child psychoanalyst, kind of, you were really thinking about the impact of the child on the adult writing the book.
I think as well, I wanted to sort of show how it's so rare now for children to be as free as Em and Ari are in the book, and that there's something very magical about Walberswick, particularly that because it's like an island. And most villages, however lovely they are, they have a road running fast through them, because this doesn't really, that children can be very free. And so obviously in the 50s, there's Alf who just, you know, gets the train, he does whatever he wants to do, as children used to do. And but that even in 2000 there were little children just roaming around, and I always like writing about children, so I was happy that, you know, Gray had some children and that some children, but I made a special effort not to give them a voice. Often slip into that quite easily.
Interesting. Okay, So let me just ask again, is there anyone else who'd like to comment verbally? I know we've had a couple of comments in the chat of people who said they've read the book once, but are going to read it with fresh eyes, having heard this discussion another time. Do we have any last questions? Okay, so one has just come through in the chat by text to me, asking whether you'd consider this a Holocaust novel.
I wouldn't give it that title, but one of the things that hasn't come up that I was really interested in was the relationship between, the quite difficult relationship between Max and Klaus, that they leave at different times. And this is something that happened in my family. So my own immediate family left Germany in 1933. They were allowed to bring their possessions with them. It was very, as I know from reading the letters, unbelievable amount of administration and work went into it, but they did. And then other members of the family who left, well, some who didn't leave and didn't survive, but then other people who left very late on and arrived as refugees. And then the different tensions. Something I would like to write more about in the family, and this is in my family, between those obviously who had they had their resources with them, and they had to then care for the suddenly impoverished members of the family who arrived with one suitcase. And I felt that Max is someone who arrives just with very little, and Klaus is someone who arrives with quite a lot, and that Klaus has a sort of bumptiousness about him and a confidence, and that he also the whole question of whether people were interned as enemy aliens is something that came up as well in my thoughts writing this book. So some of my family were naturalized. And so this happened with my father and his brothers, and the rest of the cousins weren't naturalized just because of who arrived when. And they were, spent the war on the Isle of Wight or in Australia, or, having a really very, very different war to somebody like my father who just, the divisions within the family, I would say, were lifelong. So I wouldn't call it a Holocaust novel, but I wanted to show that the life-changing effect of how, even when people survived, how they survived and what they left and what they came with and how they were accepted as British citizens or not, at what point was just huge. I didn't touch on it much, but I wanted to sort of look at that.
And Jo Fish has just put in the chat that she's reading about Thomas Mann at the moment and saying that pain of leaving Germany and being a stranger in other countries, she really felt that same sensation, and she felt the link with your book, that it's all about the sense of leaving and what that does to you.
Because I, only met people who were delighted, was sort of and the truth is I didn't meet many of my family. So my father, who was like, I am, a Londoner, this is the best place. It's worked out well for me. And then realizing from other people that I slowly met, and memoirs, and even other members of the family who'd left much later, that it was a huge heart pull to leave home and to have to make a new home. It's a really interesting subject. I mean, I was just actually asked to write. I've never ever written anything about the sort of more Freud side. I've focused much more on my father's mother's family, because really I feel too many other people have written. But I just got asked to write something for an American journal, so it's very much in my mind, and good timing for this book club. But about, did I have anything to write about Sigmund? And I composed a long email about how I had absolutely nothing. And then it was so interesting that I had nothing that it became a whole article. And I realized that, and then I started to look at that. But the fact that he stayed until late in 1938, hoping against all odds that it would be okay somehow. And, it's sort of a miracle that he did manage to leave when he did.
Yes.
So, that in itself is very interesting, and also what then doesn't get discussed in a family. So what I realized is some of the things to do with his departure and arrival, and who didn't leave, and the people he had to leave behind, never ever mentioned. And in a way, it's a way of never mentioning him, but also therefore not having to mention what happened before. So I think that's been actually very, very had a huge effect on my generation, and has been probably quite damaging, because we were sort of always the idea that you would sort of in some way talk about Sigmund Freud as if he was something in any way to do with us, but actually it's a way of not really claiming any kind of history and not having it acknowledged that there's a certain level of trauma.
It's really interesting, because obviously silence, that kind of silence, is actually a classic for second, like the experience of second and third generation survivors or children of refugees and emigres. I think it becomes heightened because of who Sigmund was and the association with your family and psychoanalysis. But actually it's maybe more interesting to the outsider because of that, but it seems to me very similar to the pattern that is experienced in many families. And I wonder, do you find yourself identifying kind of as second generation? Do you find yourself at all thinking about whether you have a Jewish identity? Like, to what extent would you consider this book a second generation or a Jewish work of literature?
Yes, I would. I think it showed me that that was my experience much more. I wouldn't necessarily have thought that before I wrote it. But it did really show me that it was extremely important for me, for there not to be such a silence. And actually, I went to this Freud Museum last year. They've completely redesigned the Freud Museum in Vienna. It's incredibly powerful. They've done an incredible job. And I went with Philippe Sands, who wrote East West Street. I'm sure so many of you, all of you may have read it. And I hadn't read East West Street before the talk, so I read it. And while we were giving this talk, and our talk was really about history, family, and silence, and we both experienced very, very similar, even though he'd grown up in a much more traditionally Jewish family than I had, a very similar experience of silence. And through both our investigations and through coming across sort of hidden stories and letters and correspondences, we'd both discovered extraordinary things about our past that had made us feel more rooted and more sort of sane and healthy in our lives. So it was a really interesting experience.
I mean, it's such interesting that so many of this generation, I mean, there's you and Philippe, but also when I went to visit the Freud Museum in Vienna, which of course was the apartment which Sigmund had left, it's just it was the same year that The Hair with Amber Eyes came out. So I also went to visit the locations that Edmund de Waal had been writing about, and it was like a 2-3 minute walk away. His family's house was just off the Ringstrasse. I mean, it's now a big casino and bookshop, but it just really struck me. Again, he is digging into that history after generational silences, and that there is something kind of this moment of the speaking out. Do you now kind of want to carry the conversations on with your next generation? Do you talk to your children at all about it?
You see, when I was writing this piece, and I was sort of saying, oh, Sigmund Freud literally was never mentioned once in my entire childhood. And I said to one of my kids, oh, there's a little exhibition of Granddad's work at the Freud Museum in Hampstead, and they said they'd never been. So obviously I've just carried it on. It's almost like something is so in the air that you forget to actually mention it. Anyway.
Well, comment. Because Victoria Polak wanted to talk to us about the Freud Museum in Czech. Do you want to unmute yourself, Victoria, and just share with us your experience of going there?
Yeah, it sounded like I wanted to talk about it in the Czech language, which I don't. No, we went to visit it because we have a house not very far from there, which came back as restitution. And it's so really interesting. There's Freud's couch is outside and my husband sort of sprawled on it for a photograph. But inside there's lots about Sigmund growing up in the area and his experience of school, and a girl that he was very obsessed with when he was young, and as well as things about, you know, what he went on to do later. So it's definitely worth visiting if you're ever around there. You might get some ideas of something for a book even, I would say.
This is where he grew up before he came to Vienna, is that right?
That's right. Yes. Yeah. It's called Przybor now. I can't quite remember what its German name was.
Because it says something that he was born in Freiburg, but maybe that's just.
Well, then that was probably it. The German names usually have no connection with the Czech name, so it would be the same place, I'm sure. Yes.
How do you spell what it's called?
It's P, and then there's an R, but it's got a kind of inverted V on the top of the R. IBOR.
Okay. How interesting. I didn't know that there was a museum there.
Yeah, well, we have been to that one and we've been to the Vienna one, but we've actually never been to the one in Hampstead, which is strange. We'll have to do that. But the only thing I don't remember is what language everything is in that museum. I can't remember whether I read it in Czech or English, or whether they have German. I think there might well be English there as well, because they must get lots of tourists, you know, who happen to be in the area going from Britain or America who are interested. Yeah.
Really interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Victoria.
And I haven't read the book, but I'm absolutely going to. I ordered it while you were talking. It sounds great. And the other one as well, the one about Hidden Thing. Thanks.
Lovely. Thank you. Well, that's the perfect transition, really, before we tie up and finish and thank Esther. If other people haven't been to the Freud Museum in Hampstead, we are taking a group with Jewish Renaissance, and actually the curator and programmer of the current exhibition on the Freud family and Lucian Freud within his family is going to give us a guided tour. So if you're interested in that, I believe that is, and Emma will put it in the chat, the 13th of October. So we're starting off on this, they're all going to be Thursdays. We're starting off with a Zoom lunchtime lecture on, I think it's the 6th of October, with Helen Fry, Dr. Helen Fry. And she's going to talk about the member of your family who ended up in on the Isle of Man and then in the SOE, in the Special Operations executive. Then we're going to the Freud Museum, as I say, with a tour from the curator. The week after, the Thursday after, a doctoral student who's working in the National Portrait Gallery at the moment on Your Father's Juvenilia is going to look at some of his early pictures and writing with us. And then Monica Bohm-Duchan, who is the founding director of Insiders Outsiders, who co-curated this series and I believe is somewhere on the Zoom. She's an art historian, so she's going to give a lecture about your father's work, and then we're going to take anyone who wants to come with us to the National Gallery to see the National Gallery exhibition. So I do hope some of you who are here will join us. But before then, I just want to say a huge thank you for being so open and for sharing so much about your process, the research, your family. I know you're revisiting it 20 years on, but for those of us who are visiting it afresh, it still very, very much holds up, and I think it's a really beautiful novel. So I do hope everyone else in the room who hasn't yet read it will do as Victoria has done and order it now. I'm going to ask you all now if you'll unmute yourselves and maybe give Esther a round of applause to say thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a real pleasure. Nice reminder of what was going on in my head so much.